Bachman's Basement is a Boink Studios production. And now, on with the show.
What happens after the world ends? But before anyone knows what that really means, before there's structure, before there's sides, before anyone understands what's coming next. On this episode of Bachman's Basement, we're talking about Night Surf, the story that doesn't focus on the collapse itself, but on the space right after it. A group of kids cut off from everything, convincing themselves they're safe while the rest of the world disappears around them. This is one of Stephen King's earliest looks at Captain Trips, the same outbreak that would later define The Stand. But here we are. There's no bigger picture, no battle between good and evil, just a handful of people sitting at the edge of the world waiting to find out if they're already part of it. I am Chris Patton, and as always, I'm here with my co-host, Chris Clawson. How are you doing, bud? What have you been up to? What have you been listening to? What have you been playing?
I'm doing excellent. Been listening to all the new Foo Fighters tracks, I guess, getting excited for the new record that comes out here in the next 10 days. And also been playing that I know we talked about on last week's episode, I'm playing the original Hades that's on Game Pass. It's my son informed me that it is what a style of game called a rogue-like, which apparently there's another game called Rogue that this game is like, where it's a dungeoner, but every time you die, you go through the dungeon again and you get more powerful. So the point isn't necessarily to die, but you will die, and then you just get more powerful and you go through it again and again and go further and further. So it's been a lot of fun. Looking forward to getting through this one so I can play the sequel when that comes out. Otherwise, business as usual. How about yourself, man?
Oh, man, for games, the only thing that I've really played outside of the norm, I've played some Pokemon Champions, which is the new Pokemon battle game. It's on Switch 2, and I think it's coming out on mobile as well at some point. But I played a little bit of that. I mean, it's all just competitive battling. So if you're not into like 2v2, or I guess it's technically double battles, 4v4 double battles, if you're not into that, it's probably not the Pokemon game for you. But I've had a lot of fun with it so far. And as far as anything else I've been playing, I mean, obviously, I think we played some Fortnite last weekend. And then I played a little bit of the And1 mixtape game for PlayStation 2. Nice. On emulation. After watching I actually watched two documentaries about the N1 mixtape, one on Netflix and one which was an ESPN 30 for 30, and it showed clips from the video game, and I was like, I remember that, so I went back and played some of that. It still holds up, and nice. Yeah, like roguelikes are cool. There's a bunch of fun ones out there. There's one that's like 16-bit that I played that's a 4-up co-player as well. It's called Streets of Rogue, which is kind of like you're battling through the it's kind of the same. It's dungeon crawler and the same thing essentially, but you got skill sets and everything that builds out as you go. But it's really cool because it was 4-player co-op. I think there's a second one of that coming out, but I still haven't touched Hades. Like I said, I've heard good things about the second one. I know that's coming out, so something I'll probably check out, but never have touched.
It's worth anyone that likes that style of game, and it's really easy to immediately get into it. The art style of the game, I think, is fantastic. Everything in between when you're seeing like the cut scenes and everything is just very I don't know what almost like comic book, like a graphic novel style animation. So very visually appealing, at least in my opinion. So yeah, but how about any B horror movies?
I do. I have one for this week. I watched Maniac Cop. Have you ever seen Maniac Cop?
No, you're always bringing something though, man. Like that's freaking awesome. Maniac Cop. That just sounds like a B horror movie.
Yeah, Maniac Cop actually stars Bruce Campbell. It came out in 1988. He is the good guy, and in the flick, he's being framed for murder. There's a cop that's going around the streets, brutally murdering people on the city streets of, New York City. And as the death toll rises, City Hall attempts to cover it up. Frank McRae, the character, he's trying to head up the investigation, and he ends up trying to convince people that Jack Forrest is the primary suspect, which is Bruce Campbell's character. And that's kind of the movie. The Maniac Cop is actually it is not obviously not him. It's an undead police officer.
Oh, wow.
There's also several of these of the Maniac Cop series. Super fun movie. Some people have said kind of like think of like a RoboCop movie mixed with like Halloween.
Okay.
As far as a comparison. So yeah, it's fun. Check it out. It's on Tubi, so that one's a free one that's easy that you won't have to search too hard for. But yeah, that is my B movie of the week.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, I don't know if there's much else.
Yeah, it's kind of a shorter things that we did this week. I didn't have a whole lot on. I was on Ray Sports and Slams earlier this week, so if you guys want to check that out, we talked about AEW's Dynasty pay-per-view as well as the NBA playoffs, and went over all of the previews for the upcoming games for the NBA playoffs, made some predictions of the first round. So check that out for anyone who's into sports that's out there. But I guess I'll jump into the story overview for Night Surf. Night Surf follows a small group of teenagers and young adults who have fled to a beach in attempt to escape a deadly pandemic known as Captain Trips. The disease has already devastated the population, but the full scope of the collapse isn't something they fully grasp. They operate under the assumption that distance equals safety. What they actually find is isolation, uncertainty, and time to think about what already might be inside of them is no safety at all. So that's kind of the generic version of this overview. Before we get into these act breakdowns and some of the characters, let's just get your overall thoughts. How do you feel about revisiting this short story? I know you said it had been a long time since you had read or listened to it.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because that main character, or the one that you're kind of in his head, he's just sort of I want to say like a snot-nosed teenager is how it feels to me. Like he's just doesn't really care about anyone but himself. And that sort of like mentality, that's sort of the lens that you're seeing this whole story through.
Yeah, there's you have two primary characters. You have the narrator, who's really just kind of observant and reflective of everything, the rest of these groups, the rest of the group. And then you have Bernie, who is the kind of the primary focus. He's kind of asserts himself early on. He's loud, very aggressive, attempting to assert control, and his leadership is basically him taking over this group using fear. Yeah, not necessarily trying to understand the situation at hand. Very much the Lord of the Flies.
Yes.
The more savage group that splits off. I can't think of the characters' names right now, but very much Bernie is falling into that kind of role.
Yeah. And then you got the girl that got sweet on him, but he's like not. Like, it's not like he's not going to take advantage of the fact that she wants him, but he's also like not nice to her. He's just like, she's like, tell me you love me, Bernie. And he's like, no.
No. Yeah, Bernie is, like I said, there are other characters in the group itself. I have the group kind of just put together here and they're more of a literary tool, kind of representing denial and avoidance of everything that's going on around them, whereas your narrator and Bernie are kind of more of the two primary characters in this short story. But let's get into Act One. Act One is isolation. The story doesn't start with the outbreak itself. It starts with kind of the damage that's already been done. The group is on the beach, already separated from the rest of the world, and they're already acting like they found some kind of safe pocket away from the city and everything else that's going on. As a group, they're trying to talk and hold on to normal life. You know, there's joking, there's casual conversations, a sense that they're trying to recreate something familiar in a place that's not really supposed to be permanent. Like they're trying to rebuild a sense of community, a sense of safety. But it doesn't take long to realize that this isn't a plan. You know, this isn't going to work long term. It's just kind of ignoring.
It feels like it's like a bunch of teenagers or young adults, you know, that just went to the beach, you know, to get away, you know, from everything, and they're having a weekend at the beach. Is kind of how it feels like with this story, even though there's so much darker things going on, you know, in this. And obviously the world is ending or has ended right along with it. But that, you know, like the line, it might be towards the end of the story, but the line where he's like, as long as there's a moon above, these waves will keep, you know, moving in and going out, you know, long after we're gone. And that's sort of the sentiment that I got from this story, which is that nothing is permanent, which is true for all of us, but, you know, it's much truer for these people in this world, sadly.
Yeah, Act One's kind of interesting in the sense of how they set up the story of people not being able to accept what's going on around them, even at the worst of times, right? So the act that they're, you know, this there is no real plan. Like I said, they're kind of just all lump each other together on the beach, and they're like, yeah, I guess we'll just ride it out here. Hopefully someone will come along and help us out. No one really talks about in the group where they came from. No details really on the backstory here. And no one really addresses what's happening beyond very vague references to the disease itself. So what happens in this act is kind of the beach feels very much, like I said, less like a refuge and more like a place that a bunch of people ended up because they didn't have anywhere else to go. And then underneath all of that, there's this quiet question that never gets asked by anyone, which is basically, are they actually safe, or is just no one here sick yet? Right?
Exactly. Are they part of the immune, or are they just, I don't know if the word is lucky or unlucky, but are they just lucky enough that they didn't contract it yet? You know?
Yeah, and that's kind of that plays up throughout the story, but it's not ever really super addressed, I guess. But we start to get more conversations, at least in Act Two. So Act Two, I called the control in the illusion of safety. This is where Bernie kind of starts to stand out as taking this role on as leader. But there's no like vote or anything. It's just he's loud, aggressive, and kind of he's the kind of person that feels like he needs to be in control of something.
Yeah.
And he's doing that by kind of fibbing and lying a little bit here, just through being aggressive. Like he's talking like he understands everything that's going on, like he has this giant grasp of the situation. But everything he's saying is not really grounded in anything tangible.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's again, the story feels like, you know, you're getting a really small little snippet of The Stand. It's almost like a scene. It could have been a chapter in The Stand, absolutely, where, you know, it's just some young people that are making the best of a bad situation, or so to speak, you know, and then it just sort of continues to get worse as we go along.
Yeah, we'll continue forward here, but yes, that's the best way to put it. So speaking of going along, the rest of the group, they kind of just go along with this, not because they believe him or think that he has any answers, but because it's kind of admitting that no one there has any answers. It's kind of one of those things where it's like, even if he's not right or at least he's attempting to be a voice of reason. And a lot of people are very afraid and very scared. And it's kind of, to me, what makes this section work is that you see how fragile the situation really is. And you kind of have this understanding of, I think, humanity in general thinking that distance away from a problem equals safety.
Right.
But that's not, it's not really escapism, right? There's no evidence that there's not a problem looming right around the corner. They haven't tested anything. They don't know if there's any disease, like if any of them are diseased. They've just stopped moving and or calling it survival. It kind of reminds me, like, every once in a while. Have you ever watched Naked and Afraid?
Yeah. I've seen the show a few times.
So you'll get that like one episode where the dude just shows up like 50 pounds overweight and kind of does nothing for 21 days, like just lives off. Like he might get a fire going and maybe a shelter, but then like nothing else gets done. But he still makes it out. And you're like, this is kind of the theory that they're going off of, is we'll just sit here and do nothing.
It's almost a reflection, or not a reflection, but a study on the decline of America, and how people are just less and less capable, and especially in our society, just to able to contend with problems. We're part of this system that we're used to just going to a grocery store to get our food, or to the doctor when we're sick, as opposed to being able to actually, take care of ourselves.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to look at it. It's definitely pointing that out, and even more so, people ignoring those things that you just laid out there, just because there's no understanding of, they've never been faced with this situation, which takes us into Act 3. This is kind of the moment where the story stops letting this group hide from what's going on. They discover a body on the beach, and it kind of changes everything, even if the group doesn't want to admit it right up front, because up until this point, the disease has been this abstract idea. It's something that happened somewhere else to other people in places that they've all left. So right now, it's in front of them. They've seen the body. Something is going on. It's now become physical, unavoidable. And their reaction amongst the group says more than anything they've set up to this point about what is going on. And much like you were just talking about, there's no clear plan to deal with what to do if anyone was infected, or what to do with this body to get rid of the disease. Like, there's no urgency. There's no real sense of protocol or understanding. It's just people realizing they're in a situation that they don't understand and don't have the capability of dealing with, something that they never thought they would ever have to deal with. Exactly. So the body kind of becomes this proof of whatever is happening out there. It isn't just out there.
Right. It's right in front of them. I felt like they found this person in a car, and then they brought them out, and then that person died. Or maybe I'm wrong. It's a pretty short story. It's only like 20, 25 minutes of listening, if you listen to it. So there's...
I don't remember the exact how the body starts within the group, like how, like, they may have found it in the car and then the person dies. I don't recall. I remember the finding of the body, right, more than anything else. So there was someone there that was alive that is now dead. Now the group has to address how did this happen,
right,
more than anything else.
And obviously, there's a mention at some point, I think it's pretty early on in the story, of Captain Trips, which is sort of a term, that we find in the Stand, that people are referring to the super flu as Captain Trips, because everyone usually towards the very end of the sickness starts to hallucinate. And then also it's, what do they call it? Because people's necks swell up and get black. And I forget what they call, but I think that they mention that name as well. And then they also just mention the variants like A6 as well as A2, and that they were apparently, they didn't, it's not that they didn't get sick, but that they got over A2. But that doesn't mean that they're necessarily immune to A6, which is what they're calling this current version of it, which is what these are just terms they've heard, I'm sure, before they got to where they were at in the story.
Yeah, that kind of goes through Act 2 and Act 3 there, where you get some. It's very vague in the way that they're talking about it, though. Like kind of. It's also how Bernie kind of seems to be able to take over these situations, is because there's no real understanding of these diseases. There's just kind of what they've heard through the news or radio before they tried to make their escape. Yeah. So after the moment with the body, the tone of the story itself, the tone of the group, it shifts. So the conversations change. There's less pretending. And even if no one fully is saying it out loud, they know that this is not working. So Bernie's control of the group, it starts to slip. His authority, it doesn't go completely away, but it's very thinner and way more forced by him as a character. And you start to hear more from the rest of the group about fear, about faith, about religion creeping into the way they're talking, and the way they're going about getting in more detail about what's happening. And, faith, in a lot of these stories, I believe that we talked about this in the Mist as well, right? You start getting this creep in of religion when people realize there's no good way out. Right. And that's kind of, you start getting this group dynamic that starts to fracture in very small ways, not big fights or giant blow-ups or anything, but very subtle shifts with less confidence and less certainty.
Well, it's natural, I think, for humans to lean on God when their understanding fails them or their situation is out of their control. It's a way to cope.
Very much so. And it's built off the group's, I think, growing realization that they haven't escaped anything at all. And that whatever is going on is probably already inside of them. So you start getting split fractures of this group and kind of everyone, I don't want to say going their own way, but definitely cliques kind of starting to form with different ideas of what's next.
Yeah. Wasn't there there's a point in the story where they tie somebody up and burn a body or burn a person? Isn't that? Am I mistaken?
Yeah, we're kind of, that kind of gets into that's all part of the finding of that body,
right?
And the kind of the breakdown of this group. But yeah, and then that takes us into Act 5, which is kind of, it's the ending of the story. It's kind of a weird ending. There's no twist, there's no big reveal, there's no last minute escape. The story kind of just settles into an acceptance of the characters themselves. They're not, there's nothing left for them to do. They're not preparing for a future. They're not trying to build anything. They're just waiting to see if they get sick, waiting to see if someone shows up to help them. Waiting to see if there's any kind of world outside of the small beach that exists in any kind of recognizable way. But it's kind of the juxtaposition of this beautiful place, this beach aesthetic, which started as a place of separation from the rest of the craziness was happening in the world, to becoming this isolation, almost like a prison island to some extent with no form of protection. You're back against the sea and just waiting. Nothing to do but wait.
Yeah. That is really, that's the long and the short of the story is, that it's almost like an analogy for life. It's like you got to prepare for the inevitable, but also like nobody wants to do that. So we just kind of go along to get along. And that's basically, it's a very short story that is impactful, but also it's sort of, it feels like sort of like almost like it could be a chapter in The Stand. Like it could have just been like, because it really does, it fits in, obviously it's a part of that world, the world that The Stand exists. And that, obviously there are a lot of other Stephen King stories that wrap themselves into that world, namely The Dark Tower. I forget which book. Well, eventually we'll get to that as well. But yeah, obviously I think a lot of people have noted that The Stand, at least in their opinion, is Stephen King's magnum opus. And this is certainly an interesting little snippet of a short story that was born of that idea.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, I think this short story came first, right? So
you're probably right. Yeah. So maybe, he was probably already ruminating on the novel The Stand, but he had this story and he didn't want to include it as a part of The Stand, I guess. Just didn't make sense. It was just it's just another little side story that wouldn't really necessarily be that important to the overall narrative of that novel.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it's like the exploration of the human condition when shit hits the fan.
Right.
It's kind of the theme of this. I mean,
yeah,
humanity's, especially in America, this denial that we have when things are going bad, as we can see in current society. And then like illusion of control with Bernie's character, right? Like this idea of like, hey, someone's here to take control and get us through this. And then just kind of the inevitability of, hey, we might all be dying very soon. So it's bleak.
Yeah,
it's
but
very short, but it is very bleak.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's not like it's not bleak in the same way like Revival last week's story was. It's not I mean, it is existential dread, but not in the same way. It's more just like the reality that if something goes as bad as, like we all lived through the pandemic and it was bad, but it wasn't as bad as, what happens in The Stand, where it's like something like 99% of humanity dies from this, super flu. But yeah, you can put yourself in that situation since we all lived through that, so that, it changes people for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, the connection with The Stand, I think, makes it actually a little scarier and bleaker to some extent than this short story, kind of the early glimpse of Captain Trips and the collapse before the full structure and weight of The Stand comes forth.
Yeah. I think that this story has even more of an impact if you've read The Stand. That would be what I would say. That this story is like, you can understand what's going on in it, but then if you've read The Stand, you're like, oh man, they're screwed. So
yeah, this would almost, especially with as long as The Stand is,
right,
in some ways, like it's a whole different character group, obviously, but it does have that vibe to it. And I tend to agree with you. I think if you're a big fan of The Stand and have never read this short story, it's worth the 24 page read or listen. I mean, it's fairly short. But yeah, fun story overall. I guess that gets us into And final thoughts and Bachman scores. I know it was a little shorter episode this week, but we have The Stand coming in the near future to you guys, so it felt like a good one to tackle.
Yeah. I thought that this story, although I think it does stand on its own and it has enough weight, and there's, you know, the themes like you're talking about, that it can stand alone, you know, as a nice little short story. Uh, it's good. It's not great, I guess. It's my opinion of it. I liked it enough. And it's short, so it's like it's easy, you know, it's not like you don't feel like your time has been wasted at all. I would probably give it, I mean, I don't want to bash it, but maybe a 5.5. Like, it wasn't my favorite. It doesn't have a whole lot of development. You know, it's sort of just, it's almost like a snapshot of a group of young people in a really bad situation. And so that, I don't know, that's my impression of it. But how about yourself?
I'd give it like a 6, maybe a 6.5 tops. I kind of feel the same way as you. It definitely makes you want more, because it leaves you with very open ending, which a lot of things could happen. They could be rescued, right? There could be, which luckily, you know, The Stand kind of clarifies some of what probably happened to this group. But in the short story, if you were reading this separately, had no knowledge of The Stand, it does just kind of cut off with just this complete isolation and them waiting to see what happens.
That's my sort of assessment of it. I'm trying to judge this story on its own merits and leave The Stand out of it. Although, knowing what I know about that story, it informs this story quite a bit. So, I think as a fan, obviously, of The Stand, I like this story, but it's just a little snapshot, which is cool, and I enjoy that. But it's not my favorite, but I liked it well enough.
Yeah, it's one of those things that if you've made it through all 1,000 pages of The Stand, also it's just kind of a nice little snapshot if you've never checked it out before.
For sure.
I believe that they did. I want to say that there is an episode of Night Surf, maybe on that Nightmares and Dreamscapes. It's not something that I was able to find, so I could be wrong on that. But I would say, you know, for this one, maybe you don't have to go out of your way unless you're already a big fan of The Stand, if it's something you've never read, or if you're going to hopefully anchor around for us, and when we tackle The Stand, maybe revisit this then, because I think it does provide a little more information and kind of, I don't know, like a deeper understanding of how in the shit this group actually is, to the point where it's kind of a little comical of some of their reactions.
Well, you mentioned it in your notes too, and I don't know if you said this already, but it's not focusing on the aftermath or the rebuilding that happens in The Stand. It's just a moment during the collapse, you know, and so that is interesting. It's an interesting point in the story of The Stand. And so just to have another small little story that's a part of that bigger narrative is interesting. And I mean, I think there's a book out there that's not written by Stephen King that is stories from The Stand, essentially just more like this. I think I haven't read it, but I've seen that was released in the last couple of years. So it feels like this is like, there's a lot of stories that could be told since the entire world is affected by this. So
as a big fan of Lord of the Flies, I kind of wanted more for this short story. You know, that's the other thing, is that the way that it kind of wraps up is just, you know, no resolution, only kind of a realization, including the narrator, the group, Bernie, that, you know, they were never truly safe. But there's no big ending, which is kind of fine for a short story. But it did make me be like, man, it'd be fun to see this group collapse on itself. As things
Right.
get worse and worse. But it doesn't give you that, and I think it's fine. I mean, if I give it a 6 and you gave this a 5.5, this might be, I think, the lowest score that we've given on Bachman's.
Maybe so. And again, I'm giving it a low score only because there's too many great Stephen King stories for me to lump it in with them. So I'm like, I don't want to bash it too hard because it is a good workable story and it's an interesting connection to one of his greatest novels. So if you're a huge fan, like you said, if you're a huge fan of The Stand, this is naturally something you're going to want to read. And it's interesting. It's informative in that way, that you're like, what else was happening? What's another story that was happening during this, the world falling apart? And this is another one of those.
Yeah, it kind of gives you that. It lets you take more away with your imagination knowing The Stand, I guess, which would probably make me rank it a little higher if we weren't comparing them completely separately. Because you could do this in any place, right? Probably not just America. They could set it in any country, any different stories going on in itself, which it sounds like someone has done. Same thing. I haven't read that, but that sounds interesting. But I would assume that you could do that, these 20-page stories or longer, to tell all of these individual tales of. It's kind of like The Walking Dead in some sense, where like all of these groups, they eventually cross paths, right?
Right. Yeah. So you live long enough, you're, in a world like, in the apocalypse, if you end up living long enough, once it's all fallen apart, then something new begins, but it's nothing that you recognize. So that is not what happens in this story. They're still in, this is like as the world is falling apart, in the first couple weeks, of the disease. So
yeah, it's interesting. I wish it was longer. I wish it was fleshed out a bit more. I mean, I know it is a short story, but we have longer short stories that give us more detail and a more satisfying conclusion. But when you make it a companion of The Stand or whatever, it's kind of just an interesting side note to I think, as you called it, like a magnum opus, right? which most people consider The Stand.
Personally, I think The Stand is one of his top 5 best books, but to me, it's not his magnum opus. I do think that The Dark Tower is his magnum opus. And by that, I mean all those stories together as one big story, which also, as I mentioned before, envelops a bit of The Stand into it as well. So that's my opinion as a constant reader. But, I certainly don't judge anyone for saying The Stand is his greatest work because, I mean, it's freaking fantastic. It's a really, really good book.
Yeah. Well, I think that's going to wrap it up for today. Do you want to go ahead and give your socials out there?
Yeah, if you're looking to find me on Facebook, Christopher Clawson, and on Instagram, Chris_Clawson 1982.
And for me, it's going to be Christopher.R.Patton on Facebook and Instagram. And you can find all of our shows at boinkstudios.com. That includes Race, Sports, and Slams, which I was just on and brought up at the beginning of the episode. Tom Clark's Main Event, wrestling podcast there that comes out every week, as well as live on Fridays at 4:00. So check that out. Bear Mode podcast, review of all of The Bear, the TV show. One Nation Under Ted, which is a Ted Lasso podcast. That's kicking back off as that new season comes out. And the 6M, the classic 6M podcast, several episodes there that I've been on. Smoking the Bandit, Gator. We've talked about Gator. We've done RoboCop 1, 2, and 3. Lots of good stuff. Recently did a review of, not really a review, but a kind of retrospective of DMX's career, which I'm on. So you can go check that out there. And let's close down the basement here. They go to the beach thinking distance is enough. Far enough from the cities, far enough from the sickness, far enough from whatever the world has turned into. Like space alone can keep it from reaching them. But it's already there, in the air, in the silence. In the way no one knows what's coming next, because it was never about where it started. It was about how far it was always going to spread. And by the time you start wondering if you're safe, it's already too late.